is that more often than not, we hold ourselves to a much higher standard that we can never ever reach. But God holds us to a standard that he knows that he can fulfill through you. All right, well, we're going back into chapter 6. Last week I was like, oh, we're just going to breeze through chapter 6 and 7. We didn't even make it through like half of the lesson, but that was an awesome discussion for anyone who wasn't here. We ended up talking mostly about the sanctification process and what crushing looks like, because Job talks about how he feels crushed by the Lord and how he perceives that crushing versus how God's perspective perceives that crushing. And so we talked briefly about how Job feels like God's arrows are being directed at him as the object of God's arrows. But in Isaiah, it talks about the servant being refined into the sharp arrow that God hides in his quiver. So it's all about the perspective that we were talking about and what crushing looks like to us versus what it looks like to God, and how that also correlates with sanctification. That's what we talked about. Am I missing anything? But so where we left off was basically in verse 9. Job says, well, we'll start in verse 8. He says, oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant me the thing that I long for, that it would please God to crush me, and that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. And then verse 10 says, then I would still have comfort, I would revel in pain, and it would not subside, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One. So here we see that within his limited scope, Job is saying that God's crushing would be the means of giving him rest finally from all of this suffering. We see similar words in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4 with the prophet Elijah. So when right after he confronted the priests of Baal who were engaged in Baal worship, they tried to invoke their god, Baal, but they couldn't do it. And then Elijah basically laughed at them, and he showed them the true power of Yahweh, the Most High God. But then after that, he found out that Jezebel was going to kill him, and so he went on the run. And while he was on the run, he says in verse 4, he says, it is enough now, Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my fathers. So after all that display, even while he was on the run, his human nature kicked in. And in his exhaustion, he just said, just take my life now. I can't take this anymore. And so it's the similar words, but both are faithful men. And they're not necessarily rebelling, but they're just overwhelmed. And this is where life can really take its toll on us as human beings. Life is hard. And the amazing thing is that Jesus lived his life as a human being, so he knows very well what suffering looks like. And he's never far from our struggles. But when he's asking for finality, he's doing it because he does believe that God's hand is active, but rather he feels like it's turned against him. And in this moment, he feels that God's hand is unbearable against him. He can't stand it anymore. And so he says that death would be a relief to him. So despite all of this, in verse 10, he says, I have not denied the words of the Holy One. So just like we were talking about last week, the crushing can be so unbearable. Everything is, the hand of God himself feels turned against me. Yet for some reason, through that his love for God, he cannot turn away from the words of the Holy One. He still clings to it despite everything that's happening to him. When you're in the trenches of suffering, and I've asked myself this too, you're on the brink of giving up. Like I've had times in my life where I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Lord, I am done. I'm mentally, physically, emotionally exhausted. And I'm waiting for you. But it's like you're not there, or you've unleashed this on me. And I don't know what to do. But somehow, and I tell myself, I'm like, you know what? After today, I'm done. I'm not doing this. But then I still continue to behave as though I'm still trusting in the Lord, because there's still that part of me that longs for him. And I cannot, no matter what I say with my mouth, my heart still clings to him, because he's the only refuge in this raging storm. Even though I'm so mad or frustrated, I know that he's the only lifeline that I have. And so I feel like what Job is going through in this moment. So Job feels crushed by God, but he refuses to sever himself from God. And this is where I think that line divides those who have relationship versus those who only know God through religion alone. Because religion can only take you so far. It takes you as far as the boundaries that religion will allow, and that you can only go so far to approach the throne of grace. And that the throne of grace is often governed by limitations and conditions. But Job knows, and we're going to see here in chapter 7, is right now he's talking about the Lord's hand, but in chapter 7 he takes his complaint directly to God. So we'll see that here. But so part 1 was essentially Job is talking about how he perceives the Lord. And then part 2 of chapter 6, now we're moving into verses 14 through 30, where he talks directly about the failure of his friends. So remember last week we mentioned how the chapter 6 can be divided into 2 main summaries, if you will. Number 1, God feels unbearable. And number 2, my friends are unreliable. So here he pivots and he essentially says, a despairing man deserves loyalty, but instead you've become like seasonal streams to me, and you disappear when I need you most. So not only does he feel pierced by God, but he feels abandoned by man. And what can you do in that state? There is nothing. There's nothing left for you. It's hopeless. As that's how it feels, at least. So again, in verses 29 through 30, he reasserts his innocence, and he's still clinging to the only ground he has left. He clings to the integrity of his conscience. Remember, he never once says that this is because of my sin or anything that I've done directly. And then he's also clinging to the character of God. So this is all he has left. And even though Job experiences God's hand as poison, we're reminded that scripture elsewhere shows us that God's arrows are also instruments of purpose. So then this tension that we see forces us to ask the question of what does faith look like when perspective is inaccessible to us? How do you perceive your own faith in moments where you just don't have the answers? And especially when you're trying to look for God's perspective and it's not anywhere to be found. Where's your faith in that moment? What does it look like to you? It's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to. And that's when we cling to God even when our perspective collapses, right? That's that desperate hope. That even though I don't understand anything and I feel like everything is collapsing, the only hope I have left is him, because I know him. And that's through intimacy that you know these things. But so the rest of the chapter, Job is directly confronting Eliphaz essentially, but he's talking about his friends as a whole. And it can best be summarized, I think, in verse 14. He says, a despairing man should be shown kindness from his friend, or he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers have acted deceitfully like a riverbed, like the streams of the riverbeds that run dry. So he's basically saying, you have turned against me essentially with your words, which I think is interesting because, often we look at how people can be there for you physically, and his friends are there for him physically in that moment, but their words turn just as hopeless for him and only reinforces his sense of anxiety in this moment. Is just that how powerful our words can be, even with good intent. Eliphaz was trying to lift him up from his own worldview, like we were talking about, but what he doesn't understand is he's essentially projecting his own fear, essentially, on Job, under the guise of encouragement and hope that he can come back to the Lord by appealing for any wrongdoing he's done. But that puts Job in a position of shame. So whether Eliphaz knew what he was doing or not, this is essentially what he's doing. And Job picks right up on it. He says, I haven't done anything. And your words are only driving me further into the ground. What kind of friends are you, right? And he says, now listen, finally, just give me your attention, for surely I will not lie to you. And he said, and basically he's going to say, now listen, this is my turn to speak. So I think for the themes in terms of Job chapter 6 is that basically Job feels pierced by God and abandoned by friends, and then he's emptied of all strength he has, yet he refuses to abandon the Holy One. That's why I think verse 10 is such a crucial verse in all of this, is because chapter 6 is a very chaotic chapter. There's a lot of God that Job is saying, there's a lot going on, but the one thing he anchors himself to is the word of the Holy One, which is God. So this chapter, I think, is more about what faith looks like when it has no emotional relief, right? When everything is stripped bare, this is what faith can look like. And it's messy. But a lot of times, I guess, culturally speaking, we tend to paint up faith as this grand thing when it's really not. Like what we were talking about with Esther. Prior to her going to the king, Mordecai confronted her and said, if you don't do this, somebody will. But she basically said, okay, well, let's take 3 days and fast about it. And I'm sure in her mind, she's like, I just need an answer from the Lord whether to do this or not. But we remember, no, she doesn't really receive an answer. And so day 3 comes and she's getting ready. And she's like, this today could either be the day that I die or the day that everything changes. But yet she's moving in faith. And so her faith is completely on uncertain ground. She has no idea where this is going to take her, but she's still acting on faith. And so that's I think the most beautiful thing about faith and how the Lord perceives faith versus how we perceive faith is that more often than not, we hold ourselves to a much higher standard that we can never, ever reach. But God holds us to a standard that he knows that he can fulfill through you. And that's a beautiful standard because then it takes the burden of responsibility off of me, essentially. But I also think that we can't simply say that Job lacks perspective as well, even though he doesn't have the perspective that he's longing for. And he can't just automatically choose the right perspective because there is no perspective. There's nothing for him to anchor to. But I think, ironically, he is choosing perspective, and he's choosing God's perspective. And this is him wrestling against himself so that he chooses God's perspective. And I think he's already chosen and continues to make that choice to align himself with the perspective other than his own. And like we were talking about before, it's like when you're going against your own nature, think of how messy that can be. And what we see here, I think, is very real and very visceral wrestling of a man who's trying desperately to hold on to the God he knows when everything around him has fallen apart. And even and especially when that same God has fallen silent amidst his suffering, he's still choosing him. He's still choosing God. He's clinging and he's aligning, and he's doing it, though, in agony. But yet he still calls him the Holy One. And that to me is covenantal language. It's intimacy that he's speaking from. So even though it's embittered, now we're going to move into chapter 7 where he actually gives his speech. So now is where he turns his speech directly towards God. And so before, chapter 6 is kind of more operating on the horizontal axis of the horizon. Now it's moving vertically to God directly. So in verses 1 through 6, he talks about the human condition. And so Job begins with the imagery of a hired servant longing for his wages in verse 2. Months of futility, nights of misery, flesh clothed with worms in verse 5. And then days swifter than a weaver's shuttle in verse 6. He's basically expressing that this is like an existential compression, which feels to him like life is short, it's exhausting, it's degrading, and it's meaningless, and it's suffering. This is how he's lamenting right now, is how he feels. So this is where I think it connects beautifully to Ecclesiastes again, because Ecclesiastes really paints the picture that life doesn't always go the way we think it does. And what do you do then? But still continue to cling to the Lord. So then in verses 7 through 11, he says, I will now speak in the anguish of my spirit. So I think this is one of the most important lines of the chapter, because in verse 11, so I'll just read the full one. He says, therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit, and I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. So here he's essentially saying that if this life is vapor, and I am already dissolving, then I will speak truthfully from my innermost self. This is all I have left, so I'm going to speak. Because remember, like, he lost all of his children, he lost all of his wealth, his health, and his reputation. So now speech is his final agency. This is the only thing he has left. And so he's taking that and he says, I refuse to be silent then. So then in verses 13 through 15, he talks about how the night is not relief. So here Job says, even when I lie down for rest, you terrify me with dreams. You scare me with visions. Originally, I used to think that he was talking to his friends, but really he's actually talking directly to God because the pronouns actually change. So it is God here, from Job's perspective, who invades even his sleep. So he's basically saying, like, Lord, you're the one that's now terrorizing me. And that now there's no longer any safe space. There's no reprieve for me, and there's no interior refuge, even in my own mind and in my own sleep. But he feels that God is inescapable, and even his unconscious mind offers him no mercy. This is why we were talking about before that the catastrophe was a physical, the first two phases was a physical catastrophe through layers. And remember, we talked about how it affected everything he owned, and then it moved inward to what he loved, and now it's moved into the soul, and this is where we see him talking directly. This is the inner anguish of the human soul. And so we're at that point now. And then in verse 16 through 19, he says, what is man? And this is an interesting verse because he's actually speaking an inverted version of Psalm 8. Obviously, he doesn't know Psalm chapter 8, but he's speaking opposite of that. So in Psalm chapter 8, it says, what is man that you are mindful of him? And in that case, it's praise. But in Job's words, he says, what is man that you make so much of him? That you visit him every morning? That's why I think it's interesting. Like, two people can say the same thing and mean two totally different things, depending on the context. So here, before in Psalm chapter 8, it was praise. Here now it's accusation. And he's saying, why are you so relentlessly attentive? Why do you examine me my every moment? And why don't you just leave me alone? He's inverted intimacy, and he still believes God is near. So this goes back to what we discussed last week about tone, marking intent and meaning, right? And it's the same structure, but opposite tone. Then in verse 20 and 21, he says, what have I done to you? And he says, O watcher of mankind. So even now, he's directing his attention to God's sovereignty. And he says, why have you made me your target? So here he calls God the watcher of mankind, and he's acknowledging God's sovereignty. This is also the language of someone who feels targeted. And he's adding the crushing line, which he says, so that I am a burden even to myself. And he sees himself not just as a burden to other people, but he's exhausted by his own existence. And then he says, leave me alone. It's basically the prayer of someone who cannot survive constant pressure, divine pressure. I personally struggle with that a lot. I make everything have to have meaning. I think I was talking about this either last week or a couple weeks ago. How complicated, I always make everything so complicated. And so before it was beautiful, the Lord met me in that part. He's like, you want complexity? You can find it. Come search me. And now he's like, but I want you to also know me in simplicity. And it drives me insane. I can't stand simplicity. That's just not how I'm wired. So for the Lord to engage me in a position now where I'm forced to trust him in simplicity, I think it's just like completely outside of my wheelhouse. And it's been a big test for me, for sure.
Is it applicable as being a parent that your children have to trust you in simplicity? Do you see like that vision of how it works? Or
What do you mean?
In disciplining children, sometimes there's simplicity, and then you can see that overall picture of the lack of the need of complexity.
Yeah, I see that all the time. Okay. And I'm like, that's why I'm constantly sort of convicted in my own behavior. It's because I see my relationship with my daughter. My daughter, she's 5, And now she can actually talk to me and we can have a dialogue. And her reasoning is so simple, but she just wants to understand why, and I have to explain as simple as I can. And I'm always like, man, it must be nice to have that kind of mind and simplicity. But then I'm like, man, I wish I could do that, but I can't, So it's like, it's really hard for me to see that and then feel convicted that I don't even do that with my relationship with the Lord. But that's what I think he's actively teaching me now, is to be the child and to be, to shift my relationship to where before there, like I still, and I think this is where I think complexity for me held a lot of control still. Because if there is complexity and I can sort through it, then that gives me the agency and the power to be able to sort through it myself. And the Lord said, fine, if that's how you are, you can meet me there. And he allowed it. But just like we're talking about the paradox of who God is that he is the first and the last. He occupies the Alpha and the Omega, the entire spectrum, the entire scope. And that he holds all of that simultaneously in himself and in his hands. And so if...
The telescope and the microscope.
That's right. And so if I can learn to love the Lord in complexity, then it is, I think, most loving of him then to teach me how to love him in simplicity as a child. And it's like removing that sort of that idea of control for me is that I no longer have to sort through it all. Now I can rely on him as a child. And going back to that mentality is like, rather than navigating life as like a partner with the Lord and seeking him out, now he's shifting the roles a little bit to where I'm navigating it completely blind. And that even everything that he's taught me through complexity, I can't rely on that right now because I have to rely on him completely alone. And it's very difficult for me. But I know it's love, but it's painful. At the same time, it hurts so much, But as angry as I get about it, I still know that he's doing it in love, if that makes sense. But this is just me analyzing everything all the time still. So I'm like analyzing every little, I'm saying, like I can't stop, and it drives me crazy. But so that's what I think. I think in a lot of ways the Lord has shifted our dynamic, and that's why it will continue to shift and grow. And this is just the season that I'm in right now, and it's not very fun for me. But at the same time, I've learned to love the Lord in ways that I've never loved him before. And it's beautiful, because you really see different sides of him and his character that you thought you comprehended in the past, but now you fully know it, right? This is what we talked about before with this whole situation with Job, is that Job has this knowledge of God through intimacy, but often suffering or tension brings out God's true character into reality. So you have a theoretical idea of God, but now you have a practical knowledge about God. And so,
do you see that it's more applicable?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So it's like now talking about certain aspects of the Lord, I can speak about that intimately from how he engages with me. And I think it's awesome. I would rather talk to or engage in conversation with another person who, it's like if I'm going into battle with somebody or into war, I want to know that you have practical skill and not just book knowledge about going into war, and you're my captain. Like, I better hope that you've already led a platoon or two, you know what I mean? And I think the same concept goes for just dialogue with people who you're trying to seek wisdom or counsel from. At least hope that they have some sort of practical knowledge in that, But also, everyone's situation is different too. So it's like, this is what I think is the most beautiful part about the Lord is that, how we're all created as women. And she brought up Proverbs 31, and I said, Proverbs 31 is a beautiful scripture. But I think a lot of times we can take that scripture and use it as a manual or a hand guide for how to be a Christian woman and lay the standard for all Christian women. But the thing is, the Lord creates each and every one of us uniquely, and we each present a different character or unique facet of who God is expressed through you as a person. And so just by you existing and your personality is in effect a witness of God's character. in each and every person. So how you express yourself, I think, is a beautiful thing. But that's why I say, like, I think the Lord is amazing in how he works through each of us. So each of our own life experiences is so unique and so beautiful. And that's why you can witness to somebody with your life and your own life experience. It doesn't have to be some grand, crazy story, because a lot of times we're living in the everyday life and people struggle. We all have the same struggles oftentimes in life. And to have somebody, a fellow person in church who just so happens to be going through a similar struggle, that means so much more to us, because now you're not alone. But that is a good point. So he feels like it's God's crushing, right? And it feels relentless to him. But Job still speaks to him, right? Even though God feels like the one that is pressing him down, he's still crying out to him. And so he's not speaking about God, just about God, like Eliphaz and all the friends do. All they do is they speak about God. But Job is the only one that speaks to God directly. So he's not abandoning relationship. Actually, he's intensifying it. It's like when you're, like any hope, I think, in a friendship or any kind of relationship that you have is like, relationship is often tested through tension, and like we talked about this before, is like I can say I trust you. And I would like to think that our friendship can withstand trial and struggle and friction. But we don't ever know until it actually happens, right? And then amazingly, through that friction or through that trial time, our bond grows stronger through that, because we know that it can withstand that. And so that's where further intimacy is cultivated. And I think that's what Job is doing here in this chapter. But both together, chapters 6 and 7, I think show that basically, showing this picture of faith without relief, prayer without comfort, and speech without resolution. But still, relationship always remains.
So the takeaway is that we all need to get in a fight so that we can bond anyway?
That's right. Yes. So I think that when God feels unbearable and life feels fleeting, faith may not look like peace, but it may look like refusing to stop speaking to him. Right? That's all we have left, is to continue speaking to him. I think that's a good picture of faith. And I think this is often the point in our relationship with God where we're forced to basically confront this mirror that's placed in front of us. And so that mirror then leads us to face a very sobering question about who God truly is to you. So hypothetically speaking, just saying, like if God were to stop answering your prayers today, and you never answered another prayer, would he still be worth it to you to worship him? Is he still worthy of your worship? Knowing his character alone, are you dependent on him for the outcome, or are you dependent on him for him alone? This goes all the way back to what we were talking about in the beginning. And the accusation that's lobbied against God in the very beginning by the accuser is that love between God and humanity is transactional. And this is the same question that we're being asked too, as well. Where does your relationship stand with the Lord? Is that if everything stopped and God no longer answered the prayers that you think, just like the outcome, it may not be how you think it is, how you think it should be, but God will answer it in different terms. Oftentimes we think of outcome in terms of physical or material or tangible things that we can see or quantify. But a lot of times God's outcomes is the transformation, the fundamental change of our heart, right? And this is where I think with the Israelites, when they were facing the promised land, God pulled Israel out of the land of Egypt and he directed them through the Red Sea. And then he prepared them for those 40 years in the wilderness. But then when it finally came time for them to enter in the promised land, he told Joshua, you take the first step and the waters will part. So I think that the Lord was preparing them all this time. But when it comes time for us to receive that final blessing, then in all that preparation now goes into action. And I think that's where that faith comes in then, is that we're relying on the Lord now to carry out everything that he's prepared us for this very moment. And it's where the Lord he steps back, but not really. He's still there, but he's saying, no, you take that step and I will I will I'll part it for you, and I will go before you. So even though you're taking the step, the Lord is still going before you, you know? But I think that, even in that moment, Job still trusts in the outcome that God will provide, whatever it may be. But basically, his trust in the outcome has to be overridden by his willingness to confront the Lord with the honesty of his heart before any outcome could ever be seen. Because sometimes the outcomes that we believe we need, like Jill was saying, is not always going to materialize the way we think it should. And are we willing to accept that, you know? Do we only want God to provide the things that we want in the way we want, how we want it? Are we going to rely on him for his character alone and recognize that he is the reward and the prize and the outcome that we want? All right, I think this is where we'll close for the day. I do hope this study blessed you and encouraged you to dive deeper into the Word this week. But until next time, I'm Tabitha, and this has been Hidden Thread.